Okay, everybody. So on our last class, we did quite a bit with this third example. And you can see by just, for example, just the imports alone that we wrote, that tons of stuff got imported just to write this code. A color object was imported, a mouse event, a mouse listener, a mouse motion adapter, a mouse wheel event, a mouse wheel listener, and the JFrame. So there's a ton of stuff being used here. Most of it is about the mouse, which is sort of what a big point of this assignment was to bring another sort of action event into play here, that being the mouse. Obviously, we could do even more. There could be keyboard listeners, there could be buttons, there could be labels. You're getting the idea now that with all this graphics programming, it's a lot of imports and a lot of manipulating code and libraries of people who've already written this stuff. So here you can see that graphics 3, this JFrame program, because again, using inheritance here, we're creating graphics 3 as a JFrame, has a number of private properties within the class. Some colors to store different color events, some X, Y for coordinates, same with count and size, just some little integer variables to keep track of stuff. And then something for the user for choosing different brushes. One to hold their choice, and one an array of preset choices that we'll be able to use when we display that to the user later on. Okay? Then what we did is we divided our constructor. So here's our constructor method. We divided that up into utility methods, into sub-methods. So for example, setFrame is called here, which does a lot of the stuff we did in the previous examples, like setting the size, setting the visibility. It even sets foreground and background colors. Okay? We also used a method called setDefaults, which just basically assigns all the properties their default values to begin with. Like the background is white, the foreground is black, etc. And then, this is the part that I kind of want to pause for a second, the listener method. Okay? We have 3 action listeners happening here. All 3 of them deal with the mouse. Okay? The first one is for when the mouse moves. When the mouse is moving around on our JFrame, if it is being dragged, in other words, it's not just the mouse moving around, but if you're clicking and holding down the mouse button and dragging, it will call a method that we wrote called mouse moving. Okay? And because the code is kind of tricky when you set up these listeners, I don't ever recommend putting a lot of logic here. I don't think that's a good idea. Because, I mean, you're already 3 indents in, right? We've indented the method, then we've indented inside this, and then we've indented here, and then it's even more, it's 4 indents in. So to then put a bunch of logic, like imagine you had a loop and then an if statement inside the loop, you're working on 6 or 7 indents at that point. I just think, that's too confused, too conflated at that point. So anyways, general sort of my recommended practice would be once you've set up the listener, call your own method, write your own method, and then pass the content down to that method, which is what we did. This one is for the mouse wheel. So we're going to do something with that wheel on the mouse. We have the ability to listen for it, so we can use it for some sort of user interaction. And then finally, this one is for the click events with the mouse. So when the mouse is clicked, what should we do? And with this one, we actually had 5 possible methods here to work with. We used the one called mouse click, but there was other ones here that we could have manipulated as well. But it gets you used to this idea that when you're writing listeners and you're using somebody else's code, you have kind of a framework that you have to work within. And sometimes that framework is a lot of code. So sometimes you have to clean it up a little bit, make it so that it's readable to you. But again, this idea that we're just going to, in the end, call our own 3 methods will therefore be useful. So we can put our code into those 3 methods. Hopefully it'll make debugging easier once we get down there. And that's basically where we ended on Friday, setting all that up. So we were basically building a big skeletal framework to actually make what we want to actually have happen. So what should we do when we click the mouse, when we spin the wheel, or when we drag the mouse? What should we do? And so that's what we're going to look at today, is what should we do when we're doing those. So the first one we're going to deal with is the mouse moving method. Okay? What should we do? And again, this is really when we're dragging the mouse. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to retrieve our coordinates. So what is x at this point when the mouse is moving? Well, x can be pulled out of this mouse event object called event. So all we do is we say event dot get x. So there's a method within the event called get x, which makes more sense. And y equals event dot get y. Okay? So we get the x and we get the y, but you think, well, okay, so now I know where the mouse's x and y are. What should I do now? Well, what we're actually going to then do is update the look of our J-frame. So our J-frame is going to be redrawn, but we're going to call a method that already exists within the J-frame object. And it's called repaint. Okay? And as you can see, what it says is it repaints or redraws this component, the component being the J-frame itself. So we're going to redraw the J-frame once I drag my mouse. Okay? So call this method called repaint. We don't write it. It's already kind of written for us. And then that's it. That's all this method's going to do. We're going to have to specify that a little bit more later, but that's all the mouse moving event does, is it repaints the screen at that point. Okay? All right. Now let's go up to mouse wheel. We're going to fill in the details for that one. So basically the wheel has two directions that it can go, right? I mean, we think of it as like down and up, but the computer doesn't quite think of it that way. It thinks of it as numerical values. So here's how you'd basically use the mouse wheel. You say if event, that's again the mouse, this time it's the mouse wheel event, event dot, and we get the wheel rotation. And wheel rotation, you'll notice, returns an integer, returns a number. If that number is less than 0, that means that the mouse is rolling one direction. It's rolling, the way we would think it is, it's rolling towards you, like you're rolling it down. So if the number is less than 0, what we're going to do with the mouse wheel is we're going to affect the size of our brush. So the wheel will change the size. So we'll just take size, our variable size, and we'll add 10 to it. Sorry, that's going to make it bigger. So, and again, it doesn't matter. We can switch that around bigger or smaller. It doesn't matter. So if the wheel rotation is less than 0, we will add 10 to our size. Remember, this code is just a shorthand. It means the same as size equals size plus 10. And then we have the else. The else would mean that it's going the other way. We just say size minus equals 10. Whoops. Which means size equals size minus 10. And then we call this dot repaint again. Same thing as we did when the mouse was moving. Okay? So again, what you have to think about what's going on here is when I scroll my mouse, I will either add or subtract to the size variable, which is going to keep track of how big our brush is. Once I've done that, I will repaint my screen. So in other words, it will reflect this new brush. Think about down here. When I drag my mouse, I will update the x, y coordinates of the mouse, and then I will repaint the screen. So at this point, this looks good, except what does repainting the screen even mean? It has no sort of context at this point. So don't bother testing this because it won't demonstrate anything actually going on here. Questions? So now we're going to do the mouse click. Okay? Now again, we're going to be calling this thing called repaint, but it has no context yet as to what it actually means. But we'll get to that in a minute. Right now, let's think about what we should do when we click our mouse. Well, actually, we've got a couple different things we can do. Okay? First of all, how many buttons are on a typical mouse like this to click? 3 is correct. How many of you thought it was 2? There's left and there's right, and what's the third one? The wheel, yeah. If you actually press the wheel down, it's actually a click event. So we're going to put code into each one of those. We're going to put code in so that when we left click or right click or double click, that's also different, or wheel click, we can do different things. So the first thing we'll do is we'll throw up an if statement. If, and let me just move this down so you can see on the screen a little clearer. We'll zoom in. If event dot get button. So what get button does, as you can see on the screen, is it returns which mouse button has been clicked. And the results of this will be one of these constants. No button was clicked, button 1, button 2, or button 3, which is exactly what we'd expect. Okay, so here's how we're going to write that. Get button equals equals, and to get the button we say event dot, and then here are the buttons. So the first one we're going to look for is actually button 3. Button 3 is the right click, because they order them that way. 1 is left, 2 is wheel, 3 is the right click. And this is also dependent on things like which operating system. Like if I'm over here on my Mac, I may not have all 3 of those buttons available to me. So depending on your OS, you may not actually have all these features. Okay, so if I hit button 3, what I should do is I'm going to change my background. Now remember, background is a color. I'm going to get my background from something called, I'm going to bring in a new object here, the J color, and you can use Control Spacebar to bring this up, capital J, capital C, and what we're going to use is something called the J color chooser. This is an automatically imported object that's a nice feature for using colors. It's basically comes from the same place as J option pane. So you say J color chooser dot show dialog. So it's very much like show message dialog. Okay, it has 3 parameters. The first parameter, you use the keyword this. Normally you'd put the word null, like you have been doing with J option panes. But now we actually have a GUI that it can match up with. So that makes more sense to put the word this there. The second parameter is what title you give it. So this should just be a string right here. Something like select background, right? Because that's what we're doing. And then the third parameter is the default color that will be there. And again, you can just leave the word background there. That's fine. Okay? So this is what that method call should look like. J color chooser, show dialog, this, select background, background. I'm just going to move that down so it's not all crammed on one line there. Okay? Now I'm just going to demonstrate what this looks like. So I'm going to run this code. And you could try yours as well. Run your code and right click on your form when it comes up. And you'll see what I'm talking about. Now you won't see the color change at this point, but okay, so here it is. So this is the one that we're working on. If I right click on that background, this will pop up. This is called the J color chooser, and it's a handy little box for choosing colors. As you can see, it has a few options. One is this sort of like, looks like a paint store, the little swatches you can choose from. But there's 2 other tabs up here where you can look like this one, looks like a Windows sort of color chooser where you can drag and pick colors. And then the third one actually has 3 sliders for red, green, and blue. You can select the sliders and affect the colors that way. Okay? So it won't actually draw the color into the background yet. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's what that thing does, called the J color chooser. I hope you think it's pretty cool, because it is pretty cool. Okay. So that was for the right click. So now we'll hit an else if. Else if event.getButton equals event dot. Now we'll deal with button 2, or sorry, button 1. We're going to go in a sort of a weird order. So now we'll just deal with, sorry, that should be button 2. We actually don't do anything with button 1 because we already have a drag event for that. So we don't need to do anything when they just click the button down. But for button 2, which is the wheel, okay, then we're going to do something there. Okay? What we're going to do at that point is we're going to ask the user what their choice of brush is. So we already kind of have that built. We have this variable choice ready to go. We already made it a global variable, which choice they have, equals. Now what I want to do is use this array up here that we set up. I think I've shown some of you guys this already, how you can use JOptionPane for that, to build like a drop-down selection thing. But rather than just throw that code on the screen, I'm going to build it into another class for this particular project called Dialogs. Oops. I'm going to build a class called Dialogs, because that's what it's going to do. And I'm going to make a method in there called choice. And for the choice, I'm going to pass it so that it can present all those choices, the variable brushes, because it's this big array. So I'm going to pass it brushes and a little title for the top of the box, which I'll just call, I'll just use the word select brush. Okay. Now, Dialogs does not exist yet. We have no such class. So we're going to deal with that next. But I just wanted to pause for a second. So now let's take care of this class. Okay? So if you want, you can use the light bulb to write this class for you. Now, there's something interesting about this light bulb. I just want to show you before you do it where you could make a mistake using this light bulb. Okay? One of the options, it says create, the first option is the one we're going to use. But the other ones, if you create a class in this, what it actually does is it, believe it or not, drops the class at the bottom of your code. Like this. This is what's called an inner class. You can actually have a class residing within the class itself. It's called an inner class. You have to make them private. They're little classes within the class. But that's not what we want to do. Because that's fine for certain things that you can code, but in this case, we're going to make a Dialogs class that theoretically we could reuse. Like we could use project to project, where anytime we need a dialog box, whether it's a message dialog or whatever, we could build it into this little class called Dialogs. So I want you to select the first option, create class Dialogs. So you have your own class called Dialogs ready to go. Okay? So we have our class Dialogs. And let's put the keyword public at the front here. Okay. So anytime you need a dialog box, you'll be able to call on this class to take care of it for you. Then go back to Graphics 3. Now that we have a Dialogs class, now we need a method within it called choice. So I'm going to use the light bulb to help write that method for me. Create method choice. So now when I go back to the Dialogs class, it has built the method for me. And at the front of this method, it's put the keyword static. Remember, I think I went over this briefly with you guys before. A static method is one that can be called without creating an instance of the class, which is exactly what we did here. We didn't say dialogs D equals new dialogs. We just said dialogs.choice. So what that means is it's calling this method without actually instantiating the class. So in other words, it's using the class anonymously. So now I'm going to also put the keyword public here. It's assumed kind of at this point, but I'm going to put public there. And I'm going to rename a couple of these parameters because for every time I use choice, I'm not going to necessarily use brushes. So I'm just going to name this thing choices, this thing just called choices. And this one is the title. So the choices and the title will be what the actual two parameters are going to be. Now this is going to return a string. Okay? So it's going to call on code that we've already seen before, some of you, which is the JOptionPain method. So I'm going to use JOptionPain. But before I use JOptionPain, I'm going to put the keyword return. So I'm going to return something from JOptionPain. Now here's where the code gets a little bit weird because we're using somebody else's code again. Dot show inputs dialog. Now you've used input dialog before. It was like in our first unit. But now you know that there are 5 different versions of show input dialog. It has been overloaded 5 times. The first one we used was just the basic one where it just displayed a message and that's it. But now we're actually going to go to one of the more complex versions of show input dialog. Okay? And it's one where we can actually use different aspects of it. Okay. So show input dialog. The first parameter will be null. The second parameter will be whatever message we want. I guess we should have passed a message to this, but we're just going to leave a blank message. So let's just put blank quotes there for the message. Okay? We could also put a null there. That would work as well. Then the title. Well, that was a parameter, so we'll just put title. Then the message type, that just depends on what icon we want this to display. So for that, and I'm going to move down a line here because I see you guys might be struggling, is JOptionPain.plain message. We'll just keep it plain. Then an icon if we need one, so a picture. We don't need a picture, so I'm just going to put a null there. And then all the values. And here you can see actually within the parameter list that that thing is an array of selection values. Perfect. That's exactly what I passed it. I passed it the choices. And then finally is the initial selection value. So which one should it show first? For that one, I just put choices spot 0. Okay? But we're not quite done yet. At the very end of this line, we still need to turn this whole thing into a string. So we're going to put dot to string. So that is, we could have put all this code back in our GUI example. But because maybe some of you might be using this thing over and over again, why not build it into a class that's going to make it a simpler interface to use? If I just want a bunch of choices as a drop-down with just a title on it, I'm just going to call on this method to do the work for me. So I'm just going to show you how this looks now. So this should happen when you mouse wheel click on something. And you see, there it is. It's just giving me all my choices at this point. So it's very simple. Okay? Okay, does anyone need a minute on that code? Okay, so that's now all cleaned up for you guys, ready to roll. So now we've dealt with the right mouse button, the middle mouse button. We have one thing left to deal with, is I want to deal with double click events. I want to make it so that if you double click on the form, because just single click and drag we've already dealt with. But I'm now going to say else if, and here's how I deal with double click events. I say event, So that's the mouse event. Dot get, and you can see there's lots of things in here about the mouse events, right? We've already used get x to get its x and get y. But you can see here there's lots of different things that we can look at, like get button. But the one we're going to get is get click count. Notice it returns an integer. So if get click count equals 2, that means it's a double click. If the click count is 2, that's a double click. So with that, I'm going to basically steal the code up here, but switch it to foreground. So that's how I'm going to change my foreground. So how to select the foreground color. So I'll use that for selecting what color the brush itself will be. So I'll use the same color chooser. And then at the very end of this method, this dot repaint again. So that will deal with how to click around my particular design. So this is the longest method we've written so far in the sense that it's got a 3-part else if statement in it. So this is for right mouse button, middle mouse button, and double click events. Okay? So we've put code in for all 3 of those things. And then in all these cases, whether it's the mouse click or the mouse wheel or the mouse drag, we're then calling something called repaint. Now repaint has already been built in to the J-frame, but it's not doing anything right now. Repaint isn't actually been told what to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to rewrite repaint so that it does do what we want it to do. In other words, a type of overloading going on here. But here you're going to actually see a slightly strange way it's done. Repaint is actually a method that then calls a method called paint, and it's actually paint is the one that we're going to override. We're going to override a method called paint. So this will be our final piece to this particular problem, and we're not going to be able to get it all done today, but we'll get it started on it. So here's how you write it. It's a method, that we write, and I'm just going to write it at the bottom of our methods. Public void paint. And paint actually has a parameter. The parameter is a graphics object called G. Actually, we'll just call it graphics again. Graphics. Okay? Graphics as an object will need to be imported. You will need to import this graphics object. It will also tell you that paint already exists, and it's asking you, should I override paint? Absolutely. We are overriding the paint method. That's the whole point, is when the screen is redrawn, we'll tell it how to redraw the screen. Okay, so I want to add 2 quick lines in here to sort of show how this works. Okay? For example, we can use the 2 colors that we had. Okay? So for example, we could do this. This dot get content pane dot set background to be the background. And then the same thing with foreground. Oops. Set the foreground to be the foreground. And we already have this code, by the way. We already have that code within, right here, within set frame. So if you want, just steal those 4 lines of code from set frame. They're already in there. Oops. So the first 4 lines will be just actually applying those colors when we repaint the screen. So I'm just going to run a quick test on that. I'm going to run it. Oh, and it does that sometimes. And I'm going to right click and set the background color to red, and there's red. Right click, set the background color to a bluish color, and there's the bluish color. So I'm actually changing the background colors now on the fly by painting the screen with those colors. Now, we're going to go into detail tomorrow as to how the rest of it works, where we can choose the different brushes and draw things. Shouldn't take long tomorrow, but I just want to give you a preview of what it's going to look like. Okay, we're actually going to put a big if statement in here, but just as a preview for tomorrow, I'm just going to show you that we're going to say graphics dot fill oval. This will be one of the things we'll be doing with X, Y, size, oops, size. Because fill oval is basically saying, draw me an oval at spot X, Y at this width and height. So I just want to show you now. Watch when I run this. So here's the background, and I click and drag, and I get this. I get ovals being drawn on the screen as I drag the mouse. I can also roll my mouse and change the size of those ovals. I can right-click and change colors. I can double-click and change colors. And it all comes together. Okay, so that's something fun to play with. Now it's getting interesting. Now our program's actually getting interesting. Now there's a weird bug in this program. Sometimes it actually screen captures your existing background. But we'll deal with that a little bit tomorrow.